Head to any university library that holds a rare maps collection, from music requests to see cartographic materials from the 1500s, 1600s, and 1700s. Not just one map, dozens. Pull out every world map you can find from those 3 centuries. Lay them out in chronological order on a table, and examine the bottom of each one. There's a continent down there, a huge landmass stretching across the bottom of the world, wrapping around the southern hemisphere like a belt. On some maps, it reaches northward to touch the tip of South America, the southern coast of Africa, or the bottom of Australia. It's not small. It's not uncertain. It's enormous. Larger than any single continent on today's map. Its labels change depending on the cartographer and the decade, but all point to the same idea: Terra Australis incognitat. The unknown southern land. Sometimes just there's Terra Australis, sometimes Magellanica, sometimes Brasilia Inferior. Occasionally it has no name at all, just a vast, detailed coastline with mountains, rivers, and interior features drawn with the precision of a place someone had actually seen. For 300 years, the most skilled, most respected, most scientifically rigorous cartographers in the world included this continent on their maps. Not as guesswork, not as a tentative dotted line labeled, maybe something here, but as a continent with coastlines, geographic features, and the same confidence and detail applied to Africa, Asia, and the Americas. It appeared on every map for centuries. Then it vanished. By the early 1900s, Terra Australis was gone, replaced by the small, frozen continent of Antarctica, which shares no resemblance in size, shape, or position to the massive southern landmass depicted on earlier maps for centuries. The modern map of the southern hemisphere shows ocean, where old maps showed land. Thousands of miles of open water where generation after generation of cartographers drew coastlines, mountains, and rivers. This raises a simple but critical question. Were 3 centuries of the world's best cartographers wrong? Or did something change? The official explanation is confident and tidy. Terra Australis was a hypothesis, an ancient Greek idea from Aristotle and Ptolemy, that the northern hemisphere's landmasses must be balanced by southern counterparts. Symmetry. Philosophical aesthetics dressed up as geography. Cartographers who drew the southern continent weren't mapping a real place. They were illustrating a theory, a placeholder that persisted through centuries of European mapmaking, because no one had sailed far enough south to disprove it. When Captain James Cook circumnavigated the high southern latitudes in the 1770s and found mostly ocean, the theory collapsed. The continent was erased. The maps were corrected. Science advanced. Case closed. I believed this explanation for a long time. It's logical. It's neat. It accounts for the broad outline of what happened. Then I started looking at the maps themselves. Not summaries of them. Not descriptions from history textbooks, but the actual maps, the specific coastlines, the particular details. And the official explanation began to unravel. Start with the coastlines, because they're the problem. If Terra Australis were purely hypothetical, a philosophical placeholder waiting to be disproved, the coastlines should be vague, approximate, and different on every map, with each cartographer inventing their own version of an imaginary continent. That's what hypothetical geography looks like. When cartographers filled unknown regions with speculative features, those features varied wildly from mapmaker to mapmaker, because there was no shared source material. Each cartographer was guessing independently. The coastlines of Australia's Terra Australis don't behave that way. They're specific, detailed, and show a remarkable degree of consistency from map to map, cartographer to cartographer, decade to decade. Pull up the Oronteus map of 1531. Pull up the Mercator map of 1569. Pull up the Ortelius map of 1570. Pull up the Jansson map of 1657. Different cartographers, different countries, different decades. The southern continent on each of these maps, while not identical, shares structural features, suggesting they're all working from common source material. Not from the same hypothesis, but from the same data. The deeper I went into the cartographic details, the more the hypothesis explanation faltered, because hypotheses don't produce consistent coastal features across independent mapmakers over a century. Hypotheses produce variation. What produces consistency is shared source material, charts, navigation records, earlier maps that later cartographers were copying, adapting, and refining, source material that described a real geography. The silence was deafening when I started looking for that source material. As if they were following instructions they didn't fully understand. Because the source maps, like those for the Piri Reis map, like those for every anomalous cartographic tradition I've investigated, don't survive. Cartographers reference them. Some cite earlier charts explicitly. Some describe their sources in general terms, referring to Portuguese navigation records, to ancient maps, to charts obtained from other cartographers. The references are there. The sources are gone. A consistent pattern, the compilation survives, but the evidence it was compiled from has been lost, destroyed, or absorbed into institutional collections where it became inaccessible. Now look at specific features of the Terra Australis maps, because this is where the official explanation doesn't just falter, it collapses. The Oronteus map of 1531 shows the southern continent with a level of detail far beyond a philosophical placeholder. Rivers flow from interior mountain ranges to the coast. Bays indent the coastline in specific, consistent locations. The proportions and positioning of certain coastal features correspond with remarkable precision to the actual subglacial topography of Antarctica, as mapped by modern seismic surveys. Not the ice-covered Antarctica that modern explorers found, but the land beneath the ice. Pull up the Finney map and compare it to a modern map of Antarctica's subglacial topography. Compare the coastal indentations. Compare the positions of apparent river mouths on the old map to the positions of subglacial drainage channels on the modern one. The correspondence isn't perfect. It wouldn't be across centuries of hand copying, across the accumulation of errors that any manually reproduced map acquires over generations of transmission. But the structural similarities are close enough that the coincidence explanation requires a coincidence, so extensive it strains the word past its useful meaning. The deeper I went, the more I found that the Terra Australis maps don't just show a vaguely imagined southern continent. They show a southern continent with specific features that match a real geography. A geography that shouldn't have been knowable to any civilization that existed during the period when the maps were made. A geography that was buried under kilometers of ice. A geography that could only be accurately described by someone who had seen the continent before the ice covered it, or who had access to technology capable of seeing through the ice. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision when you compare maps across centuries, because the consistency of certain features suggests not that each cartographer was blindly copying the previous map, which would produce increasingly degraded copies, but that multiple cartographers were working from a common body of source material, independently interpreted and rendered. The variations between maps look like the variations you'd expect from multiple translators working from the same original text. Each translation is slightly different, but the underlying structure, the bones of the geography, remains consistent. Here's where the thread connects to the timeline of disappearance, because Terra Australis didn't gradually fade from maps. It was actively removed during a specific period, roughly between 1770 and 1900, the same period that keeps appearing in every investigation I pursue. The period of institutional standardization. The period when old maps were replaced by new ones. Old knowledge was classified as superstition, and old sources were archived in collections, where they became inaccessible to anyone outside the controlling institutions. Captain Cook's voyages of the 1770s are cited as the definitive disproof of Terra Australis. Cook sailed through southern waters and found ocean, not continent. Therefore, the continent didn't exist. Therefore, the maps were wrong. Therefore, 3 centuries of cartographic tradition were based on a mistake. Case closed. But Cook didn't sail everywhere. He circumnavigated at high southern latitudes, but he didn't survey every degree of the Southern Ocean. He encountered ice barriers that prevented him from reaching the actual Antarctic coast. He concluded that if a southern continent existed, it was smaller and farther south than the maps depicted. His conclusion was reasonable based on what he observed. But it wasn't the definitive disproof that the official narrative presents it as. Cook demonstrated that Terra Australis, if it existed, wasn't where the maps showed it at its maximum extent. He didn't demonstrate that the maps were entirely fictional. He didn't explain why the maps showed consistent coastal features. He didn't address the source material question. He sailed through empty ocean and declared the case closed, and the cartographic establishment followed his lead. Within decades, Terra Australis was being reduced on maps. Within a century, it was gone entirely, replaced by Antarctica, a small, frozen continent that bears no resemblance to the vast, temperate, geographically detailed landmass that centuries of maps had depicted. The official explanation collapses here, because the removal of Terra Australis from the world map wasn't a correction based on comprehensive survey. It was a correction based on partial evidence. Cook's voyages extended by assumption to cover the entirety of the southern hemisphere. The assumption was that since Cook didn't find the continent where the maps said it was, the continent didn't exist. But that assumption ignores the possibility that the maps were depicting something real from a different time. A time when sea levels were different, when ice coverage was different, when the geography of the southern hemisphere was not what it is today. Go back to the ice core data. Go back to the sea level curves. During the last ice age, global sea levels were over 100 meters lower than they are today. The coastlines of every continent extended far beyond their current positions. The continental shelves now submerged were dry land. And Antarctica, depending on the period and the extent of glaciation, may have had significantly different ice coverage than it does today. The possibility that as Terra Australis, maps depict the southern continent as it appeared during a period of reduced glaciation, a period when coastlines were exposed and are now buried under ice, isn't pseudoscience. It's a geological possibility that the cartographic evidence supports, and that mainstream archaeology has never investigated. Here's what I keep returning to: the pattern of removal. Terra Australis was removed from maps during the same period when old knowledge was being systematically replaced across every domain I've investigated. Old calendars replaced with new ones. Old currencies replaced with new ones. Old building methods replaced with new ones. Old maps replaced with new ones. Each replacement was described as a correction. Each correction removed something old and replaced it with something that served the institutional needs of the new order. And each replacement was accompanied by the loss or inaccessibility of the source material that might have allowed independent verification of what was being replaced. The deeper I went, the more the disappearance of Terra Australis looked like one chapter in a much larger story, the story of a world that was remapped, recalibrated, and redefined during a specific period of institutional transformation. The old maps showed something. The new maps show something different. The old maps were based on source material that no longer exists. The new maps are based on surveys that didn't cover the entirety of what they claimed to disprove. I'm not telling you there's a hidden continent in the Southern Ocean. I'm telling you that 3 centuries of the world's most accomplished cartographers drew one there. I'm telling you that the coastal details they drew show consistency that random hypothesis doesn't produce. I'm telling you that some of those details correspond to the actual subglacial topography of Antarctica, as measured by modern instruments. I'm telling you that the source maps they worked from have vanished. I'm telling you that the disproof of Terra Australis was based on partial exploration that didn't cover the territory it claimed to eliminate. And I'm telling you that the removal of an entire continent from the world map happened during the same period when every other form of old knowledge was being systematically replaced with new institutional standards. I'm asking what the old maps were showing, not what the textbooks say they were showing, but what they were actually depicting. What source material produced consistent coastal features across centuries of independent cartographic work? What geography those coastlines correspond to, if you account for changes in sea level and ice coverage? What was known about the Southern Hemisphere before Cook's partial survey was accepted as complete disproof? I'm asking why an entire continent was on every map for 300 years, and then disappeared from every map within a single century. Go look at the old maps. Look at the coastlines. Look at the detail. Look at the rivers and the mountains and the bays that 3 centuries of cartographers drew with the same confidence they applied to Europe, Africa, and Asia. Look at what was there before someone decided it wasn't.